teammates for being here. Today the resolution is the U.S. penal system rehabilitation should be valued over the retribution during sentencing. And I have three main observations. My first observation being that the penal system is a college for criminals, basically. My observation, too, is that the U.S. penal system is inhumane. It locks up people and doesn't really work with the real issues. And my third observation being the drug offenders and other criminals that were not understanding the real reasons as to why they're there. We're just locking them up. So today, Judge, if you would, the criteria being preponderance of evidence, rehabilitation meaning change of their personality, and retribution being sentencing. We definitely want you to favor our rehabilitation and vote affirmative ballot. I'll go ahead and go to my observation one. As far as the penal system, basically we're locking up people in cages. We're treating them like dogs. We're not understanding the real issues, and when criminals go in there, they'll go in for a drug offense, selling marijuana. They go in and they end up with a doctor's degree and selling like coke. You know, they go in with one offense and they come back out knowing how to do 10 times more. We're putting them into a hostile environment where they can learn how to sell drugs. I'm sure that they can find a way to get drugs. And on top of that, all of the inhumane issues that we're dealing with prisoners being inside the prison, getting stabbed and raped, and all the violence going on in the gym yards where they're all out there working out, hitting each other with dumbbells and whatnot. This is a serious issue that we need to be working on. To my second observation, it's so inhumane that we're taking people and we're putting them in cells with no human contact. How are they supposed to come out of jail being locked inside of a cage for 10, 15 years and be a productive citizen of society? How are we going to take them and say, I'm going to lock you up because you did a bad thing, and when you come out, you need to be a whole, completely changed person, without dealing with the serious issues, their mental illness issues, and their deeper issues of their childhood and whatnot? We need to be making sure that they're rehabilitated into society instead of just throwing them in a cage and hoping that when they come out, that they're not even worse than they already are. Going to my third observation, drug offenders. Why are we not understanding? We're taking someone who's been on drugs and we're throwing them into jail and they're going through withdrawals, horrible, painful withdrawals. So someone goes in on meth and they're like, oh my gosh, going crazy, and then we end up with violence between the jail, the jail officers and the criminals inside jail. We end up having these spats and these issues and all these fighting because we're throwing them in there. They're going through withdrawal. They're not being rehabilitated. They're not being treated for the issues that they're going in for. Drug offenders stay in jail longer most times than child molesters. This is something else. We need to be working on all the different types of criminals, not just drug-related offenses. We need to be working on rapists, and we need to be working on murderers and child molesters and figuring out the deeper issues as to why they committed the crimes that they did and rehabilitating them so that in 20 or 30 years when they come out, they don't go and do the same crime. They don't go and rape another child, and they don't go and murder someone else. We need to rehabilitate them so that they understand what they did was wrong, so that when they come out, they can be a productive citizen of society and they can say, I did a bad thing and I paid my time for it. And now I'm here, and I'm going to get a job, and I'm going to work, and I'm not going to do the same things that I did in my past. That's something that the penal system is not working on. They're not working on making sure that mental illness and that these criminals are understood for what they did. They're just throwing them into a box like a dog, like a cage. Just say, here, sit in there and rot for 30 years, and we'll see if maybe you're acting better when you come out. Most of the time, if you go to jail, people who get out, they end up back in jail. They're always repeat offenders. Excuse me, not always, but most of the time they end up being repeat offenders because they were never examined and understood and talked to and rehabilitated to be into society. This is why our criteria of evidence is extremely strong. We have seen these people go to jail and come out and do the same thing that they did before because they're not rehabilitated. However, if we had the U.S. penal system changed to where rehabilitation was a possibility instead of being thrown into a box, we could have drug offenders and we could have child molesters and rapists and murderers going, let's say, yes, it's a type of jail, but they're not locked in cages. They're going to rehab. They're learning how to get off drugs. They're learning how to be a better citizen. They're learning all the things that they did wrong. Maybe going to church, maybe finding faith, being educated, taught to do something like a trade outside of jail so that when they get out, they are rehabilitated. They understand what they did wrong. They know how to change themselves, and they are willing to do so. When people, drug offenders especially, go to jail, they go to jail. Yeah, I had a marijuana, whatever. They go in there, they meet up with some people. Oh, they also have marijuana too. Let me show you how you can do something better. You want to sell coke? You want to be a coke lord? You want to do this? I'll hook you up with my guy on the outside, and we'll go do some coke when you get out. Oh, wait a second. Let's hook up with these, cartels and whatnot going back and forth. If you've ever seen the movie Blow, it said, bachelor's in marijuana, and I came out with a doctorate degree in coke. Here's the thing, we need to be worrying about these people who are going in. It's so inhumane to just throw them into a cage for the next 30 years and say, I hope you act better when you get out. We need to be teaching them. We teach our kids in school how to be a productive citizen. When a kid gets in trouble, they get spanked, right? But they're taught what they did wrong. They're told how they messed up and how to better correct themselves. If you get a bad grade on a test, your parents, they yell at you, they ground you or whatnot, and then they're like, you need to be working on this. Let's study together. Let's take tutor classes. Let's make sure that everything that you did wrong, you know how to correct. We want these people who are in jail to learn what they did wrong so that when they get out, they can be a productive member of society. We don't want to just throw them in jail and let them rot. We need to stop punishing them and instead understand them. We are so worried about punishing them and punishing their soul that we don't understand how they're feeling. Thank you. I hope you vote for the front of the club.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the Leader of Opposition for an 8-minute constructive.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Ms. Prime Minister for laying out this case today. Thank you, Mr. Adjudicator and peanut gallery here. I'll go ahead and give a roadmap of what I'm going to do today. I'll start by talking about the terms, going into the 3 points that they laid out before us, and then I'm going to go into some off cases and present our material that completely contradicts with this, and hopefully you'll see some clash and have a good debate. With that, I'll go ahead and start with their terms. They referred to retribution as sentencing in their terms, and that was a little ambiguous, but I understand the point that they were trying to make, and it's pretty straightforward. So we accept the terms and the judging criteria, which is the preponderance of evidence. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and go into their 3 points, provide some evidence that we found in our research, as well as go into our off cases. The first point that they had was that the penal system is college for criminals, and that people come out of jail knowing how to be worse. As the burden of proof falls on the government, I'd like to ask when they're back up here to hear some kind of evidence, to have them address some kind of data that shows how many criminals come out of jail with these repeat offenses that are worse than what they went in there as, some kind of data to back that point up. Their second was that it's inhumane. We're treating people like dogs. They have mental illnesses. For that, I'd just like to say that during a hearing for a criminal, when they're going through court, there are mental evaluations to check for mental illnesses, and if that's the case, then the proper courses are taken for that. Also, they brought up the third point that drug offenders go through terrible withdrawals, and that it's miserable and that it's so bad for them, and that drug users stay in longer than rapists. I'd just like to say that this is a very big sweeping generality about drug offenders versus rapists, and the drug offenders stay in longer than rapists. That's very much a sweeping generality, and there's no specific instance, or they didn't provide any specific numbers on how often these drug offenders are in there longer than rapists, or how these drug offenders are being physically harmed or actually going through harm by getting off drugs. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and talk about the nature of what our penal system is. When you look it up and you look up the definition of penal, it is of or pertaining to punishment for crimes and offenses. That's the reason this system was going. So that can go ahead and talk to, again, their point one and kind of a counterpoint there, that our first off case should be that the penal system is created to punish criminals. And it's created to punish criminals. This would be sub-point A to our off case, because it increases crime deterrence. By making our penal system a system of retribution and punishment, it deters crime. It makes prison a place you don't want to go. And that's the idea. Also, thirdly, the retribution aspect of prison, or secondly for our off case, the retribution aspect of our penal system provides justice for the victims of these crimes. For people who have been victimized by murder or rape, it is a form of justice to those people, knowing that their criminal is being punished for what they did to them and what they took from them. Also, our third off case is that the whole theory of justice is that they are now indebted to our society for breaking our laws. Our laws are there for a reason, and when you break them, you are then indebted to society. And to repay for that, that's the retribution aspect of our penal system, which is by far more important than this rehabilitation aspect that they discuss. Our fourth off case is the cost of turning our penal system into a rehabilitation center. And for instance, I'd like to bring in for sub-point A of our off case 4, that Scandinavia is set up in a rehab system. That's how their prison system is set up, as rehabilitation, and that costs about $1 million per year per prisoner. Right now in the United States, it costs about $60,000 a year per prisoner. And so that's a huge difference there. And it's not a step that we're ready to take. Our nation is not in a position right now to take that step to do that. And while I do agree that human life is important, that doesn't mean that this rehabilitation aspect should overturn the retribution aspect of what our prison system was designed to do. Yes, one of you.
I do have a question. Do you have any statistics on how many people are in the Scandinavian prisons versus how many people are in the United States prisons?
Well, first of all, it doesn't really matter if there are more people in the Scandinavian prison than the United States prison, because what we're looking at is the cost per individual prisoner. And so if you think about in aspects of our nation and in our system, whether or not we have more, it would still just point to the point that we are not ready for that. We aren't ready to have the expense of $1 million per. And so that number, whether they're spending $500 million versus whether they're spending even more than that in the United States, is really irrelevant to the case as to how many there are there. The point of the Scandinavia point, in case that's unclear, is that it's extremely expensive. Whether Scandinavians' prisons are more full or less full than ours, it demonstrates the expense per individual. And so just to clarify the response to that question, even if it is more or less full, it's the amount per individual prisoner, which the United States isn't ready to tackle that yet. Again, just to reiterate through this and clarify again, their first point that the penal system is a college for criminals and the people come out knowing how to be worse wasn't addressed with any statistic or database principles. The next point, that it's inhumane and that we're treating them like dogs because some of them have mental illnesses. Again, we pointed out that mental illness evaluations occur during the hearing process. And thirdly, they talked about the drug offenders staying in jail longer than rapists and used a lot of sweeping generalities with that. And so I believe we've effectively proved why the government has not met the burden of proof on their 3 points that they provided, as well as we've provided 5 strong off-case points. The first being that, yes?
I just wanted to ask you a quick question. When they go through court and they get mentally evaluated, if they do have a mental illness, do they get rehab once they're sentenced?
If they have mental illness, the court determines what is the best course of action to take for that particular. It is taken into consideration.
But they might not necessarily get rehabilitation.
It depends on what's best for that individual. It's a case by case. We can't go in and say some sweeping generality is what's taken for each individual with each mental illness. The matter is the court does take into consideration right now mental illnesses in their hearing process, and that's part of our legal system right now, is to take that in, and that is a humane step that our government takes to ensure that people with mental illnesses do get the form of punishment that is best for them and that is best to our society and our humane society as it is. And it's not inhumane to allow retribution to be over rehabilitation, because that's what our penal system is designed for. That's the purpose of it. It is a system of punishment. It is a system of justice. And it's justice for all. It's justice for those who are harmed by the crime. It's justice to our society as a whole, because they become indebted to our society when they broke the laws of our nation. We talked about how crime deterrence is because this system is created to be a place people don't want to go. It's intended to create crime deterrence. If we make it a place just about rehabilitation, the crime deterrence may not still be taken into effect. Our next off case was that it provides justice for the victims, that it provides justice to our society, and then again we were illustrating that our nation isn't ready to tackle the financial burden of doing this by illustrating that per individual it costs $1 million, whereas in the U.S. right now we're currently spending about $60,000 per prisoner. And with that, I believe we've adequately met the burden of proof, or adequately shown that the government has not met the burden of proof, and I urge you to vote for the opposition. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'd like to recognize the member of government for 8-minute constructive.
Opponents ready? Judges ready? I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Obviously, I really am enjoying this debate. Okay, so let's see. I think that there's a lot of things that you can not obviously, but there's things that are wrong with this particular rebuttal. Drug use is not considered a real, it's considered a mental illness to drug rehabilitation centers. It's not necessarily considered a mental illness in court cases. And that is something that is true. This is true. Because otherwise you would see people who are druggies, or whatever you wish to call them, drug users. They wouldn't go to jail. They would go to rehab if that was what the court considered a mental illness. Prison doesn't necessarily deter crime. Otherwise there wouldn't be something called a phrase of prison mentality. Prison mentality is a phrase that means a person is usually fairly violent once they come out of prison, and they are often paranoid about other people seeing them, and they don't have the same mental, they're just not the same in personality. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any data as to how often that occurs?
Not at this time. However, I can say that there are multiple documentaries on this particular problem, and that there are multiple documentaries dictating also prison problems which have been addressed. Safety, the fact is rehabilitation is safer than prison. It creates a world with less criminals and more people that are instructed and helped and made better in society. They are able to go back into society as a better person. It helps. Our prisons are overflowing. That is something that is time and time again the government is having major issues with the fact that our prisons are overflowing. And the fact is that yes, maybe, it is $1 million per person in Scandinavia, and I'm not saying that that's anything to do with the problem, but the thing is that I think that the money that would be spent on these prisoners would be used in a better way. Because right now, there are overflowing prisons, which we are paying tax money for. We are paying huge amounts of money for not only just these prisoners, but making prisons, because our prisons are overflowing.
with the fact is that rehabilitation will make these people able to be in society, therefore able to make more money. They would be able to have a job. They would be able to keep a job. They would actually bring back money once they are rehabilitated and put it back into the system. Again, I think that it's a major thing that the only thing is that drugs in prisons are also something that is a problem. I think that it's really true. It's a college for criminals, especially in drug use, because, you know, there are kids that go into jail because they got caught with marijuana at school. And let's say they got caught more than once. Let's say they got caught maybe 2 or 3 times. These children get charged as adults. They get charged as adults and get put in prison for years because they were charged with something like marijuana. I mean, even cocaine. The fact is that all you're doing is putting them in a box. It's not helping them. They can come from any type of background. They can come from inner city, but they can also come from somewhere as simple as Arkansas or Tennessee. They're just kids. They're trying to make money. Let's face it, the economy sucks. It's hard to make money right now. The jobs are hard. And not only is jobs hard, yes ma'am.
What percentage of prisoners in our penal system right now were drug offenders when they were still in school? Like, we're just kids.
That I don't know.
It's a little specific, just keep moving on.
Okay, thank you. I think that it's a major problem. It happens. I mean, I know people. I have friends and relatives that's happened to. And I just live in a little podunk town. I mean, I don't live anywhere special. That's just the truth of it. And it's just, the fact is that the penal system is not helping. That is proven. It is not helping. We need to try something else. We need to at least try to do something else with these prisoners. Because it's not helping. It's just putting them, ultimately, a lot of them, more than at least a quarter, they're repeat offenders. They do it again and again and again and again. And it's just because all they're getting is being put in a box. So all they're doing is getting put in a box. And sometimes, yes, you know, and then on top of that, when they're not in their box, they're usually in a place where a bunch of criminals are, and that starts fights and riots. And it's silly. It's silly to put people who have done things wrong in a box and not do anything about what they did. Just put them in a box for a few years and expect them, especially to expect them to come out of that box better than they were before. I think that it's a major problem in the United States, and that prisoners would be at least able to have a life once they get out of prison. I think that it's amazing how sad this penal system has become. I do believe I think I shall step down, and I really do hope for an affirmative ballot.
Thank you. Now we'd like to recognize the member of opposition for an 8-minute constructive. Thank you. Just make sure you give me a roadmap which way you're going first.
Okay. First, I want to thank everybody and the government for providing a good case to argue, and my partner, Mr. Adjudicator, and our members of the peanut gallery, and roadmap for the adjudicator. First, I will address their main points and offer some criticism of those main points, and then offer some ideas as to why, other ideas as to why those plans will not work, and the justification for that. So first, that prison is a college for criminals. Prison is not just a college for criminals. There are many different avenues available for prisoners. It's not just a college to learn how to do more crime. Prisoners have access to GED programs. They have access to prison psychologists. They have access to doctors in prison. So it's not just a place they go to learn to do more crimes. They can learn already to be better members of society if they utilize what is already offered. The idea that, to their second point, that it is inhumane. It shouldn't be a summer camp. It's prison. But it's not that inhumane for most prisoners. If you look at most prisons, they have cable TV. They get 3 square meals a day. Their clothing is provided. They have a place to sleep in the dry. They're not in the horrible weather conditions. Prisoners are in better shape in many cases than some people who are living in free society. To their third, that many times drug offenders do not understand why they're there. It's widely advertised that drugs are illegal. From the time we are in elementary school, you have the DARE program. We have police coming to our schools telling us how bad drugs are and what's going to happen to us if we take drugs. So saying that they don't understand why they're there is not a valid argument for not, putting them in prison instead of rehabilitating. Like saying to the locking them in cages, we're not locking them in cages. They are regulated. If anything is out of control, we have groups that go in and represent the prisoners. We have a policy against cruel and unusual punishment. The prisons are highly regulated. It's not like we throw them in, toss a piece of bread into their cell, say, there you go, and that's the end of it. The idea that, which we heard a couple of different things from the government that in the inhumane, that they have no human contact or they have too much human contact. You kind of have to go with one of the two. They get the contact that they need. They have people they can speak with. Yes, there are other criminals there. It's a prison. They're going to learn things or they're going to hear things that are going to benefit them in criminal ways, but they also have the opportunity to hear things that will benefit them in positive ways. Yes?
Let's say if a person is locked in, they're in prison for 30 years. They live in a jail cell, and they have a certain amount of area that they can go, eat, shower, and work out in, correct? So they have this confined space that they have to live in, and they're there for 30 years, and they get out. Do you think that they're going to know how to properly act after 30 years of being confined in a small, specific area in a big city like New York? Do you think they're going to be able to know how to react on a bus? After 30 years of having no contact with anyone but jailers and criminals, they're going to be able to act normal in society.
In many cases, when a prisoner is let out, especially if you're talking sentences of 30 years or more, that's generally violent offenses if it's 30 years or more. Mm-hmm. And most of the time when you are let out, you're not just let out and go. You are put out on parole. You have a parole officer. Many times they are put into halfway houses to help them readjust into the world. The halfway houses help them find jobs that will let them work and understand their situation. So we're not just opening the prison door up and saying, okay, you're free now. There's already things in place such as halfway houses and parole boards that help them do this.
But their probation officers aren't with them 24/7 though, right? They have so much time to be on their own doing whatever they want to do wherever they're at. Who's to say they're not going to suddenly go back and be violent and act the way they did before?
It's a possibility that they will, and many violent offenders, when they are let out, are tagged with ankle bracelets. That way, while you're on probation, they know where you are at all times, and if you go outside of the area that you are designated to be in, then you have violated the terms of your probation and you go back to jail. And back to the government's argument that rehabilitation is safer. Safer for who? Safer for the criminal? Yeah. If we're going to send them to a rehab center, what's to stop them from committing, if they're a murderer or something, a rapist, what's to stop them from raping or murdering someone in the rehabilitation center, as opposed to being in prison where they can be much more closely monitored, as opposed to a rehab center. And we're not just throwing nonviolent offenders in with hardcore murderers. We have different levels of prisons in this country. We have minimum security for nonviolent offenders. We have maximum security prisons for extremely violent offenders such as murderers and rapists and even domestic terrorism. We have designated places depending on the crime that you have committed. And many times we even have house arrest for nonviolent first-time offenders. And to the government's claim that children are being charged as adults in drug crimes, I haven't heard any news story where a child has been charged as an adult in a drug crime. If a child is charged as an adult, it's generally in a murder case, and it's all over the national news. That's something that everybody hears about. And we're not sending mentally ill people into most of these prisons just without any regard. As my partner stated, every time there's a trial, there is a mental evaluation. They decide whether a prisoner is mentally fit to stand trial. If that prisoner is not mentally fit to stand trial, they are put in a mental health system until they are able to stand trial and understand the actions that they have committed. And again, as my partner stated, our penal system is for punishment. I think we're spending too much time worrying about the welfare and the mindset of the offenders, and we're not taking into account retribution for the victims. We have to think about the victims in the case as much as we do the criminals. Someone that's raped 5 or 6 times and finally gets caught, there's probably not enough rehabilitation in prison to stop that person's mindset. There was just an execution in the state of Virginia last week. A man in jail for murder. He killed another inmate. He flat out told the prison system, if you don't kill me, I'm going to kill somebody else. So he was executed. Someone like that cannot be rehabilitated. So we cannot put a blanket statement over everything saying everybody has a chance to be rehabilitated, because not everybody can be rehabilitated. So without a definite plan as to which groups will be rehabilitated, which groups will not be rehabilitated, the government's plan simply is not feasible at this time. And with that, I want to thank the government.
Just a quick question, has anybody written down the times that these speeches are going? No? Cool. All right, I'd like to recognize the Leader of Opposition for a 4-minute rebuttal. I'd like to remind you, no new arguments, but new analysis and examples are allowed.
Just to give a little roadmap of how this is going to happen, I'm going to go ahead and talk about some dropped arguments that have occurred during this, and go ahead and give some voters as to why the opposition has won this debate. The first dropped argument that I'd like to address is when we discussed the crime deterrence and that these prisons are designed to facilitate crime deterrence. They talked a little bit about how the idea is that once they get out into society, they won't be repeat offenders, but that doesn't address the fact that our prison systems right now are designed to do that, and that was the reason that retribution was taken over the rehabilitation. The next dropped argument that I'd like to point out is we discussed the theory of justice in itself, the accepted theory of justice, which is that they've committed a crime against our society by breaking our laws. So again, that wasn't even addressed how criminals are indebted to our society, and therefore that's the retribution aspect, that they're paying our society back. So that's also something that can be taken across the flow. The third dropped argument was that it provides justice for victims. That, again, was something that we brought up, how a murder victim or a rape victim, and that's something else that can just be pulled across the flow. I'd like to talk to our main A priority voter, which is that the government failed to meet the burden of proof and did not adequately prove that that rehabilitation should be over retribution. And as this debate is being judged on the preponderance of evidence, the evidence that the government presented for the penal system being a college for criminals, and that it was inhumane, when they talked about mental illnesses, we already countered that with that there are already mental evaluations that occur prior to sentencing. So those do not meet the burden of proof on the government's behalf. Also, they talked about how drug offenders go through withdrawals, and that they stay in longer than rapists. And they used a lot of sweeping generalities, and they were discussing the prison system as a whole and who's in there for what crimes, rather than meeting that burden of proof and giving some kind of data or evidence on how we can assume that drug users stay in jail longer than rapists, or or arguments of that nature. So I'd just like to again reiterate that, Mr. Adjudicator, if you believe that the government has failed to meet the burden of proof, then please vote for the opposition. We have shown reasons why retribution is so important and why it is such an important aspect of our penal system as it is. In fact, as we presented the definition earlier, the penal system is created in definition as something that is of or pertaining to punishment for crimes and offenses. And we believe that that should be the nature of our prison system, so that crimes deter, because we're not ready to take the next step as far as costs go to implement this system. As we gave the example of, it's $1 million versus right now what we can afford is $60,000. And I'd also just like to point out that the government brought up that our prison systems are already overcrowded, and we are already having funding problems with it. So just to that, again, that only strengthens our argument that we're not ready to take that next step as far as costs go. And so again, just with the cases, with the arguments that have been dropped, and again, with the government failing to meet the burden of proof, I have enjoyed this argument and this debate, and thank you all. Please vote for the proposition.
Thank you. All right, I'd like to recognize the Prime Minister for a rebuttal, not to exceed 5 minutes. Remember, no new arguments.
All right. Everybody ready? All right, real quick, I just wanted to touch upon a couple points that opposition made, such as the not worrying about, it's inhumane as far as we're concerned to lock someone up in a box. And they said, we are too worried about the welfare and mindset of offenders. Okay, me personally, I really believe that if we are going to make productive members of society out of these criminals, we need to be worrying about their welfare, and we need to be worrying about the humanitarian issues that we're dealing with within the jails. We did point out the increasing crime deterrence point that they made earlier, the fact that jails are overflowing, so it's obviously not decreasing crime, deterrence. Like, if we're still filling up our jails cram-packed, people are not too afraid to go to jail to not commit these crimes. So we did touch upon that point slightly. As far as the justice, justice needs to go both ways. As far as I'm concerned, if a person is going to jail for doing something, there has to be a deeper mental issue within them. Something must have happened to them to make them act the way they do. It's not just that you wake up one day and say, oh, I want to go kill somebody. There has to be something in your head or something that's happened to you to make you want to do that. We need to be focusing on making sure that those people are taken care of and that they understand what they did. They're not just somebody who woke up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to go kill my sister. It didn't happen like that. We need to be worrying about the welfare and the humanitarian issues within the jails about these people. We need to be making sure that we're teaching them and having them understand what they did wrong so that when they get out, they can be productive members of society. We're packing the jails full because we're packing them with the extreme, the murderers, the whatevers, and then the drug users. Why not take the drug users out of the jail setting and make a rehabilitation? Okay, if we put all the drug offenders into rehabilitation, they are more likely to leave and not be doing drugs afterwards or selling drugs afterwards or whatever. Then that also solves the problem of the jails, of the overflowing, of us having to build new jails constantly. If we're spending $1 million on someone in Scandinavia, that's like 3 dozen people here in the U.S. for $60,000. That's like 3 dozen people per that one in a different country. That's 3 dozen people that could get some kind of mental illness and rehabilitation and whatnot. If we're worried about crime and about safety in the U.S., we need to be making sure that the people who are committing the crimes are understanding what they do and that when they get out, they can be productive members of society because eventually they're going to get out. Eventually. And if not, they're going to be killed and then we don't have to worry about them. But we are paying for them to be there. We're paying for their clothes, we're paying for their food, we're paying for the facility, we're paying for all the people, and we don't need to take the extra step, as my opponents have said. We do need to take the extra step. That's why we're having all the crime problems. That's why when our criminals are leaving jail, they're still committing the same crimes because we haven't taken the next step. We're not worried enough about their welfare and about their mental illness problems and about what's happened to them in their lives to make sure that when they leave jail that they are productive members of society. This is what we need to be worrying about. We don't need to stand back and not take the next step because we don't have time for it. This is the time to do that. This is the time. Yes, our economy's bad. I understand that. But here's the thing. We have tons and tons and tons of people in jail who are just sitting there, who are just doing whatever. Yes, they can get a GED program. Thank goodness. They need to be being educated. They need to be being taken care of. This needs to happen. We need to increase it. We need to take the next step and make sure that when they are leaving jail, they know how to operate, and they know how to communicate, and they know how to act in society. You can't take someone who's been in jail for 30 years in a confined space the size of this building and say, you've been in this jail for 30 years, I'm going to let you out. Yes, they have a probation officer. Okay, maybe they have an ankle bracelet, but there's not someone there holding their hand to make sure that they didn't do what they're doing again. That's why we need to rehabilitate them. They need to understand what they did wrong. We need to teach them and teach them and teach them and make sure that when they leave, that they have all the potential in the world to be a productive member of society. And if we don't do that, we are not doing our job. Yes, we need justice for the victims. Yes, absolutely. They need to pay for their crime. Understand that completely. But we can't say, you messed up. Big time. Yes, you messed up. I'm going to put you in jail, and for the rest of your life, no one is going to care about you. You're going to sit in jail for 30 years. We're not going to teach you how to be a productive member of society when you get out. When you get out, you're just going to go, and we're going to give you a probation officer and hope that you can make it. That is not what we should be doing. We should be worried about these people. They're locked up in a box for so many years, and then they get out, and it's freedom. What did we do when we came to college? You've been living with your parents all night, all your life, and you get to college, and you're like, I can stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning. I can do whatever. We need to be doing the same thing to these people in jail. Thank you so much. I hope you're voting for the ballot.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Let me just give you a real quick critique. I'll try to. Hi, camera.
Is that okay?
It's fine with me. I think this was a good round. Okay. Flow was all over the place. I'd like to see a little more structure. This is just stylistic. This is take this with a grain of salt, okay? But run through your definitions, judging criterion, and then move on to observations. It was a nice preview, but choppy, right? Like 1, 2, 3. Let me go back. Now let me continue. So maybe that. Let me just go down the flow because there's several arguments that I think are kind of being missed here that could have really helped both sides. You came up with a judging criterion of preponderance of evidence, and then I virtually have no evidence, okay? You cited a Hollywood movie, which I love Blow, I love Johnny Depp. I knew the reference before you even said it. That is grounded in reality, okay? But you need more than a Hollywood quote, I might use the Hollywood quote as a tag, right? Something to like jazz up what I'm talking about, and then try and find an example to prove that. Recidivism rates. You could have said recidivism rates are at an all-time high. There's a very tricky line with evidence when it comes to Parley, okay? And I know I rushed you I rushed the debate along whenever I said that was a little too direct when you were asking for percentages. You're like, what's the exact percentage? That's not exactly how you should handle evidence because all statistics can be flawed. I mean, just at the base premise, there is a statistic that disproves every statistic innately. So, you want to watch asking for like exact percentages, but it's a good idea to say, well, where's your warrant? Where's your evidence? Like you did on their first one. But if you guys would have said, well, recidivism rates are at an all-time high, which means usually the people who commit a crime commit the same crime again, okay? That shows that their at the very least, it shows that they're not learning from their mistakes, which you could say is proving that they're learning to be bad, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you can make the argument, I think. You don't have to say 78% of all people, will go back to jail. You don't have to say that, but you can say, like, the common person knowledge is based on a well-read student, okay, of a bachelor's degree. If you were a, not political science, but if you were maybe a sociology major and you were a senior, you might know actual statistics that you could cite, but in any event, I mean, you're allowed to, you have some latitude when it comes to, we know this to be true. It's in the news, it's in the media. Jails are overcrowded. Overcrowding can help prove that people are going back to jail instead of making the right decision, you know? Which you made that argument when it comes to the funding, okay? Just talking about funding real quick, I think you guys could have made an awesome point on funding when you were saying, well, how many people in Scandinavia versus how many people in America? You could have segued into something like, there is a much lower percentage of people in Scandinavia that are put into rehab than there is in America. I mean, obviously the populations are not the same. So if there's 1 million in Scandinavia and there's 1 million in America, that would be drastically different percentages because America has so many more people. It's just so much bigger and particularly warmer. But in any event, kind of draw out these differences. Like, hey, listen, in Scandinavia, yeah, sure, it may cost $1 million, but their recidivism rates are lower. And you couldn't have looked that up, but there are ways around like evidence, but there needs to be a little bit more of a link to evidence. Also, I would like to have seen a value come out in this round. I got a judging criterion and preponderance of evidence. I don't have a highest value, and like when the resolution says value, I mean, you need to, your evidence should prove your value in a value round, you know? So, I don't know, if the government team probably should have said a value of personal safety, or a value of community, you know, because you're all about trying to help the people who, help for the needy, right? Who's more needy than a problematic child? A child who's not causing problems, a child who is causing problems, you know, you can see there could be some need for more attention, right? You can make these connections, so I would like to see a value come out. Going down your observations, I really like that drug abuse is considered mental illness, but not by the penal system, necessarily. But I like that argument. And then going down into the second, where it's inhumane, I thought it was really ballsy for you to say, like, in some cases prison is better than life. I mean, I guess if you're homeless and you have a warrant so you can't go ask for food stamps for fear of being put in jail or something, like, yeah, maybe I think that's probably a very insignificant number and amount, probably a very weak argument. I'd probably stray away from saying, like, prison is better in some cases than living on the streets, but hey, I'm libertarian, so, I like liberty. Another thing about the mental illness, one of the questions in evaluating whether or not you're fit to stand trial, evaluating your mental cognitive ability, is if you know what you did is wrong. And, a lot of your argument was weighing on this. They don't know what they did is wrong. If they don't know what they did is wrong, they're usually not fit to stand trial, and that's when they receive mental help, mental institutions and whatnot. If they are found to know what they did is wrong, then usually they stand trial. So that really kind of shifts that argument, in their favor. But it was a really good straw when you said, yeah, but mental illness patients receive rehab. You are emphasizing how we do recognize that rehab is necessary or useful. Also, I thought it was much more philosophical over here and much more pragmatic over here. What's actually happening in the world versus what maybe should, shouldn't, what is morally right, you know, the whole ideology. So it's kind of like two ships passing in the night, right? There was crosstalk between them, but I don't think you guys were hitting on, well, their philosophy is wrong, and I don't think you guys were hitting too much on their pragmatic approach. I'm not voting on deterrence. I think there was equal say that it does improve deterrence, it doesn't improve deterrence. It's kind of a moot point because there wasn't like more analysis to one side or the other, so I'm not voting on that one. You guys can take a little liberty with their off case. Their second off case was provides justice. Their third off case was justice. I have indebtedness to society. It's the same off case, essentially. I mean, it's a twofold off case, you know. So you could have said, like, you know, let's condense that, collapse that. You got all you guys need to do the line by line. Dropped arguments are important. You kind of mentioned them in your final speech. You kind of have to hit every point. You know, it's just important for the judge to follow along. In the beginning of your speech, I don't want to hurt. I know judges who have not who have voted on dropped arguments, or they won't flow you if you're not where they are on their flow, and then they'll vote on the dropped argument. I will put in place where your argument needs to go if you haven't necessarily told me where it goes, or at least where I think it fits best, just for the sake of like debate, weighing these options, you know. But you really need to follow the structure to make these arguments. And the whole argument about, you know, some people who do drugs, they can get longer sentences than like child rapists. While I'm sure there are examples of this, that is not the norm. If it's the third strike, like a 3-strike law, you know, then yes, you know, mandatory maximum sentencing, like sure. But you know, marijuana most of the time is like simple possession, misdemeanor. You know, you're not going to see more jail time than a child rapist there. So like, just kind of watch that, and I don't know, just all together. Watch the questions too. Questions are not supposed to be more than 15 seconds, and again, I don't know how long it just seemed like a really long question, and then you followed up, and I don't really like a follow-up if you're trying to prove the same point, which you did. You were like, but seriously, you know, it was as if they almost gave you the answer you wanted, and then you were like begging the question to try and get them to agree with you, and naturally they shouldn't agree with you. They're the opposite side. So try and like come up with a second question if you need a follow up or something. And I also told them it was specific knowledge, but I told you to move along. They were asking about specific knowledge, and then you said, I have friends that went to jail. Like, there's nothing more specific than that. So like, stay away from those examples, and try and stay away from hypotheticals. You know, unless you've seen something like crazy big in the media, and you set up like a parallel hypothetical, you know. Anyways, that's just what I have. But feel free to talk to me after I turn in my ballot. Oh, and voters. Voters are crazy important. I don't have a single voter on my flow. I mean, I guess I could say like one voter of, like, philosophically it's not right to put people in a box. And I can respect the pathos, the appeal to emotion, but you need a little more than that, you know, a little more either ethos or logos. So, good job, guys.
Thank you.